There's one thing that's been bothering me as an aspiring video game composer, and it specifically has to do with the quality and style of music that's being used for video games now. And it's mostly something I've noticed over the past couple of years with increase in games that feel similar to each other and like any real type of creative originality. And as someone who studies and makes video game music, I've been thinking about why that is, and I think I have some ideas that I can explain clearly that explains that. But first, before I get into that, I wanted to ask a question. If I asked you to sing melodies from the last AAA games that you played, could you do it? If yes, maybe this video won't surprise you, but stick around. I think it might make you question some of the stuff that you've been listening to. If no, well, your question should probably be why. And speaking of why not subscribe and hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, or let me know in the comments if I'm totally off base. Okay, cool. Coming back to the real why, I want to show you guys something first. If you're someone who listens to a lot of video game music or even just plays a lot of video games, you might recognize this name, and I'm talking about the great composer for the Final Fantasy series, Nobuo Uematsu. He's the music composer for the Final Fantasy games up until 9, and along with some other notable credits. But in an interview from 2024, he makes some interesting comments on the direction of video game music and how it compares to the older video games that we know and enjoy. The first comment I want you to dart your eyes to is his comments making comparisons towards Hollywood film score. This modern period has led to game music becoming less interesting, according to Uematsu, because some directors and producers are satisfied with movie soundtrack-like music in games. Now, just think about that for a second. In modern video games, we're using these very lush symphonic orchestras to record the music. We have these very well-produced, overproduced sound design that's going on, but despite that, the music still barely leaves an impression. So you could say that it's polished but forgettable. Though I think the root of what it is that Uematsu Sensei is trying to say is that there's a lack of melody in video game music. What does that have to do with movie soundtracks, you say? Well, I'm glad you asked, old sport. Take the Star Wars soundtrack. Think about the Darth Vader Imperial theme, or even think about the heroic motif for Luke Skywalker. Now think about any other modern blockbuster or any modern big budget movie that you've seen recently. Could you remember any of the themes or melodic themes for those movies compared to the ones from Star Wars? And let that sink in for just a real second. And it's not like, older melodies are better. It's just kind of that now we don't really use melodies, and we kind of have a lot of like drones and textures, and a lot of these cues are the sound very polished but forgettable. Very well produced music that doesn't really leave much of an impact. So ultimately, I think the point that Uematsu Sensei is making is that game soundtracks are starting to go into the direction of modern film soundtracks. And, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And I think the answer is both yes and no. So here's the thing. It's like when you're making and creating a piece of music, you're just making a narrative, right? Like art is a narrative. And when you're making a piece of music, you're just making a musical narrative. But when you're adding it to a movie, everything takes a backseat to the movie because the movie already has the narrative. So there is no real narrative that the music has to tell for it to be impactful, because it doesn't need to be impactful. It just needs to kind of take a backseat. The issue with scores that are very melodic heavy, like the John Williams score for Star Wars, is that a lot of directors don't want the music to distract people from the overall narrative of the movie. And, I think, a video game is a little different though, because a video game is kind of like a movie, but ultimately is way more interactive. And so you spend a little bit less time like just consuming in a video game, but you spend a lot of time doing. Because of that, a lot of music in video games can ultimately be a little bit more active and have actually these melodies that we enjoy a bit more, just because that the story is usually spread out between different cutscenes or different moments in the game and between times of us doing it. So, and when we're actually doing something, the music can kind of come up, and then when the music needs to come down for the narrative to take over, then, you know, we can kind of flip that switch. It's kind of why, you know, we have these specific themes for different places. So if you're fighting a boss, you have boss music, and if you're in a shop, then you have shop music. Though I think that leads into these different styles of video games, that we have these very different like sections. They're becoming a bit outdated, you know, at least within the major titles that have been released recently. Like today's games are more realistic than they've ever been, with these like really large stories and these large worlds. And I think they really want to retain a sense of subtlety with the music for the sake of the exploration of the player, because a lot of these games are like operating with these super open world formats that kind of essentially take away these very specific sections like the way we used to. In a way, video games are kind of moving similar to what movies are, in a way that the narrative isn't necessarily turning off in the active sessions, but the narrative is actually like being combined with what it is that we do in a video game. Anyway, whatever this weird gray line is, I think it offers an idea on why things may sound different to us. But I think ultimately that kind of tells us that it's not necessarily from a quality standpoint. I don't want to say that melodies are better or worse, or being more memorable is better or worse, but it's more about the context of what the role of music has changed from being this thing that helps to drive the video game experience and is actually able to tell its own narrative in its certain circumstances of the game, to now having to take a backseat because the game's narrative never really shuts off nowadays. And then I think the question starts to become, why are video games moving towards a style that doesn't allow melodies to become memorable? Real quick, I want to go back to the interview with Uematsu Sensei and check out these comments real quick. So he says that people need to have more freedom when creating game music. Otherwise, game music cannot develop further. Game music will become interesting if composers consider what is something only I can do, and use their own knowledge and experience to be truly creative. Freedom, that's the key. Real quick, here's some numbers that I want to show you guys. In 2024, the gaming industry generated a total of $184 billion in revenue, and nearly double the combined revenue of movies and music. 10 years ago, that number was $83.6 billion. So something that I've been noticing is that profitability in art often discourages experimentation and boldness for something that's a bit more cookie cutter, to help subvert expectations and to serve the mainstream expectations. Here's something that a musician I respect that he says, and I think it relates to kind of how we feel as artists, but your love for the art has to be greater than the concern for yourself. And this is meant, you know, for artists who are on a journey to constantly improve their craft. The people who care about the art of video games, or who care so much about the art of music, they care so much that they'd rather live, check the check, and struggle than to stop creating, because what they create is the life that they ultimately live. That's what feeds them and fuels their hunger. And I think this creative mindset kind of ends up where the only people who end up having control of the art are the people who end up having the most money or have the most desire to make the most money. So notice in the beginning how Uematsu said that the big reason for why composers are changing this music is because of the influence of directors and producers, and not necessarily because of the composers and their own thoughts towards what's needed in the music. Just imagine that the people who control all the decisions for your favorite game have never experienced being in a battle with a boss and like having to use your last heal on a character that keeps dying. These type of people know how to make a great product, but they don't have the real creative spirit to dive into these games. And that still leaves us with games that feel often polished, but forgettable. So I guess my issue isn't that modern video game is boring, is that modern game music feels less memorable, not because the composers are worse, but because industry pressure to make Scrooge McDuck levels of profit reduces to creative freedom that once produced distinctive melodies and distinctive music. So what do we do now? Well, the first thing is to stay on the lookout for a lot of indie games. I feel like a lot of indie games kind of push back and they're always still creative because, they understand that they're not going to make the most profit, but they just need to make enough to live and continue creating. And there's plenty of creative work that's being done in the area of smaller developers. Ultimately, though, if we really want something to change, I think we have to make some type of big impact and we have to come together. And that's kind of why I asked you guys to subscribe. And, one of my biggest dreams is to seriously have like a creative studio that's like multidisciplinary, or where different people are able to create from different like mediums and we can combine each other together. I don't know if this idea will gravitate higher than just a dream, but you might as well stick around to figure out. I appreciate you for watching this video, especially for finishing all the way through. Till next time, and I hope you have a good one.